So everyone, we're back with another video. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about friction. So Tom, we were in a call with the engineering team, um, and there was a moment where I got a little bit confused because you were suggesting to the team that we needed to add a little bit of friction into kind of how our processes work. And in my experience, a lot of times you want to be removing friction from processes so that they're smoother, easier, things happen faster. And I know for us, velocity is a very important thing. We want to move fast, move quick, and get things done quickly. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit this idea of like kind of like why you thought, or why you were proposing to kind of add friction into our process there.
Yeah. So I think first of all, we've added a lot of friction in many steps of the way, like since starting, and like that recent call you're referring to, that was like just like another incremental addition. I mean, I'll give you like the most obvious piece of friction, right? We do code reviews. Like you can't just go and have people just merge code. Like you need to have someone else go and review the code and and before that, get that in, and that's friction, right? I mean, that slows down development significantly. On the other hand, and what you get is increased stability, increased like more alignment to product direction, better, less technical debt, more sustainable development, more involvement from the team. You get like a lot of really nice benefits. And I think, like the same idea of just like introducing friction in areas, in the process in order to increase other areas. I mean, I think even like in physics, right? You increase friction, you increase heat. So maybe heat is a good thing in some areas, right? So it's and I think for us, like it was really important to how you work on like just adding friction in like in relevant places. I mean, I can give you like a few other examples, right? Um, like the person, like first of all, I mean, you have the reviews, but also like deployment is done by only some people that are like designated for deployments. And the idea there is that you have like a small team that is, like first of all well trained, but also just have the kind of like the process in place to make sure that the deployment is correct and like verifying it before it gets deployed. I mean, obviously, there's although the automated testing and all of that, but still you want like another manual error review before deploying. And then, like there's like security reviews of like PRs. That's like friction. That's just like, it's a waste of time, right? But no, because we want to be secure. So if you don't have that kind of like extra step of, of slowing things down, to do what's necessary, then like you're not gonna get, you're gonna maybe move faster, but it's kind of like going, you're gonna drive full speed towards the cliff, right? Instead of just like staying on the track.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So one point, in order to move fast, sometimes you got to slow down. So make sure you're not going in the wrong direction. And then you're saying also sometimes you need to move slow to make sure you're not breaking anything.
Yep. And again, it's not necessarily slow. It's just kind of like one step, kind of like pause, just like pause for a moment. It's not even like slowing down, just like pause for a moment and have a think. And I'll give you another example, right? When you're as like a single developer on a project, this is like blazing fast. You're like super, you're like Superman. You move so quickly. You come up with an idea, you write some code, deploy. You can do whatever you want, like in a very very high speed. But maybe you didn't think through this change, and actually it's gonna it's gonna cause issues. And if you don't have that process of kind of like multiple steps, like stopping, it's like, hey, now I'm putting my reviewer hat on. Let's look at the code I just wrote. Is that any good? Oh, I should, change that. Like, okay, let's merge it now. Let me take a pause, have all the CI run, put my deployer hat on. Let's review it. Is it ready to be deployed? Does it break API? Does it change it, add new API that we don't want to like not ready to release? Does it change behavior? There's like, there are like a lot of like things that you need to check in different places. And I think when you're like just one person, again, frictionless, you just like run as fast as you can. You don't have all of those like breakpoints, like just pausing to have a think, for even for just a moment. And friction, by the way, I mean, as you said, like I love velocity, right? I mean, like for me, it's like one of the most important things. So it can be frustrating to want to slow down, and engineers love velocity as well. So that can be frustrating. And but it really is like, learning to slow down is like I think like a very important part of developing like high quality, reliable, secure software.
Mm. How would you balance that though? Because I know one of the like issues that companies run into when they get larger, right? Is
Yeah.
I'm assuming they're introducing a lot of friction into the system for good, maybe good reasons,
Yep.
but then things just kind of start to grind to a halt. There's a lot of bureaucracy, red tape that you got to get around all the time, and you start to move maybe too slow, or maybe to your point, it can get frustrating for the developers.
Yep.
And that's something that gets brought up quite often when companies get to like a certain scale, and it's like very hard for those types of companies to maintain kind of this like startup mentality because they've had to add all this friction.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. I think part of it is really just focusing on velocity and like having that. I mean, I'm gonna use the word metric, but having that as like a metric, as like something you don't necessarily need to track and have a graph of, but really just something that you care about. And and you are ready to evaluate or reevaluate every step of the process all the time. I think that's like an important key thing. And the other one is I'm gonna like maybe the word contained. So like contained and tight feedback loops. I think the problem with like the larger companies is that you write some code and then DevOps team that you never met is going to review the infrastructure part or maybe do the infrastructure part, and then the security team that you never met is going to do a security review. And the problem is that Joe from security is out, and Rachel from DevOps, is only gonna, she's like busy with some other project, and the feedback loop and like just like the velocity, the actual velocity, never mind like the pausing to think, but like the actual velocity is really hindered because of all of this added non-friction, but just like added pauses. And I think that's probably one of the most important things. We haven't reached like the 5,000 to 50,000 employee scale yet, but I think this is definitely something like I would really hate it if we become one of those like extremely slow companies. And I've worked in in like similar institutions before, and it's really depressing. So I guess just to like summarize what I just said now is like understanding that maybe evaluating why it is that you're pausing and being extra extra careful about what you're adding and all the unnecessary gaps or latency that you're adding to the process.
Right. So you would think that these big companies, it's more of a latency issue, maybe than a friction issue, or is it both?
Probably both. And I think, like to be more cynical about it, it's kind of like, you have a security team. Security team needs to justify why they exist. So they would go and say, okay, like we have to review every PR instead of just PRs that touch the whatever, whatever, whatever. And by the way, not judging security. Maybe it is the right call for that organization, or maybe that is the right call for every organization. Um, I'm not taking any side here, but I'm just saying that like maybe they're overzealous and and like they don't have to live with the implications of that, right? I mean, like they're not slowed down by anything.
Well, yeah, and I think fundamentally, maybe once you get to the point where they're that big, the value that you've already generated that already exists is so large.
Yep.
It's worth sacrificing the velocity and adding that extra friction to protect what you've already generated versus trying to go faster and generate more. It can be hard,
Yeah.
right? Like if you're Google already, like how are you gonna like get that much bigger? It
Yeah.
makes more sense to just like secure what you have. So it's probably to a point just like some law of building companies to some extent.
No, I think that's actually a great point, right? I mean, like if at best one change can make like and the extreme end like a 1% incremental improvement to the whole
Yeah,
company, and
and that
that's
would be
like
insane for Google if
extreme.
it's
That's
one
yeah,
if,
that's
if one
insane.
change makes 1%. That would be insane for
Yeah,
them.
but even then, is it worth risking it all just
Mhm.
for to ship it 5 hours earlier or like 5 days earlier? Maybe not. So
I guess so far we've talked about friction that's like actually useful, I guess, in terms of like, okay, maybe you're actually going to go faster or you're preventing errors. Are there any instances where you're kind of just like adding friction for like, how do I put it? Maybe like cultural reasons or like kind of like psychological reasons. So like, just as an example, right? If you're what you're trying to do is build a more security conscious team, even if it's not helpful, maybe you do add some like security checks just so that people understand how important it is.
yeah. I mean, we do. I mean, we don't even need to go far, right? I mean, like we have kind of like checks in the blog posts that we write. We don't even need to go to like product development. You have to go and like you have to go through like mark that checklist, even though it's like very obvious. Have a title, that's good. Make sure the title matches whatever. We have all of this checklist that you created, and I think even that's like friction. But that kind of like pause is like a pause for people to just make sure that they're not making mistakes. So is that not the example that you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could work, but like the example that I had in mind, like I used to work for like a security awareness company, right? And we would purposely like give out the security tests, like your annual security awareness training. We would do it like monthly, right? It's not necessary to do it monthly. It slows us down to like make people do it monthly, but the whole point of the company is to be security aware, right? I mean, you could argue that there's value there in that, like, if we get hit with a security breach, it kind of kills the company in a way. But really, like, what we're trying to do is to get everybody to understand that this is what the company is about. And so it was more like a cult, like a value add from culture perspective. It's really just like purely psychological, right? Like the actual doing of the tests, you don't need to do it monthly. Even like, okay, some people do it quarterly, and that's good. But like in the numbers that we were looking at, like monthly didn't really make that much of a difference. Like quarterly was better than annual, but monthly was kind of overkill. But we decided specifically we wanted to do it overkill to kind of like build that into the culture of the company.
Yeah. I don't know if I have like a good example like that because I think all of the examples that, yeah, I mean, I don't think we have like a culture example. I mean, we have examples that are, again, like more functional. So, I mean, for example, I said the word example a lot, but like, for example, you have, we don't deploy on, like on the weekend or like late in the evening, except for like extreme circumstances. And the reason for that is, we don't want to make, in case there is ever an incident, we don't want to have an incident for our customer on a Friday night. For us, we're actually okay with that. If we're already working, you know, at those hours, we don't mind continuing to work, but we don't want an incident or any kind of like error to show up for our customers and ruin their weekend or ruin their holiday. So this is in a way friction because we're slowing development down, but again, it's functional. It is functional.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
this is something that a lot of people follow anyway.
Hmm. Then I guess like a question I would have is, a like, how do people recognize if they're actually adding friction? Like, or like maybe this is a concept that to me, like to me it was a bit foreign, right? It's like the example that I only came up with after having this conversation. Like, oh, okay, maybe this is what we were doing, right?
Yeah.
But like at the time when we were doing it, that's not how we thought of it, right? So like, I mean, like, is this adding friction necessary, and you should actually be like seeking it in certain cases, or is it not really maybe necessary to think about it in this way?
Yeah. Hmm. I mean, yeah, that's a good question, actually. I'm trying to think if friction has purpose on its own, right? I mean, we're getting very philosophical here, but I think it's really just like we care about the function. So, like, if there was a way to elevate everyone's security consciousness at that previous company without causing friction, I think that's
Hmm.
preferred, right?
Yeah.
And but maybe the word is kind of like sacrifice, like what the term is maybe should be like sacrificing velocity for friction. So it's kind of like recognizing that there is a trade-off and choosing that trade-off, in places
Hmm.
that you wouldn't otherwise. Like otherwise, why would you give up
Okay.
security, velocity? Sorry.
Right. Okay. So it should be pretty obvious what's going wrong, like what problems the velocity is
Yeah,
causing
I think you need
before
to
you
stall.
shouldn't be like, hey, I saw Tom and Ken talking about adding friction. I need to go find some friction to add.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm trying to also like kind of like to refer to that conversation that you mentioned in the beginning of of like our chat today, and yeah, it wasn't. I think it was more like an allowance to give up, to
Mhm.
sacrifice a bit of velocity, rather than just like, hey, we should let's just add some random friction somewhere. Let's do no deploy Tuesdays. No, it's nothing like that. It's really just there was function behind all of those, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So like, when we're talking about it, it seems obvious right now when we're talking about it that you want to
Yeah.
add friction,
Yeah.
right? But like, I'm assuming that there are plenty of instances where when you go in and try and add friction, I mean, even in the call, some of the team were pushing back on it,
Yeah.
right? So why does it seem so obvious for us that adding the friction is good, but you'd get a lot of pushback, maybe from your team, or even like it's not intuitive for you to see it that you should be doing this, right? Because it's
Yeah.
so kind of ingrained in most people's heads that friction is a bad thing.
I think, so this is actually a great point. And going back to my example earlier, which like with a single developer, you don't want friction. I know what I'm doing. Like, am I going to review my own code? Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, I know what I'm doing. I can just move fast. There's no need for that. But I think that like friction, like I would, as a single developer, I doubt you do, like people often do like code review for yourself, like not a rigorous one anyway. But the problem is that if you don't force that friction into your workflow, like if you don't, for example, I'm going to make something up, have a mandatory 30-minute pause between merge and deploy. Just mandatory. Like even if you're a single developer, this is mandatory. The UI is going to prevent you from actually doing deploy. I think that will force you just like, well, I'm wasting time anyway. I might as well kind of like think further about like what I'm doing. And actually, like another example is which is like a good product solution maybe for that, but like, the undo send that you have in Gmail and like in Twitter and all of that. I mean, this is their way of like doing it without friction. But the idea is that like, wait, you're gonna make a mistake because you're so quick. Like, you're gonna make it like pause and have a think for a second. And I think like the same thing is kind of like what friction is there to achieve. It's kind of like forcing you to kind of like do that pause, even though you don't need it. I know what I'm writing. I'm gonna proofread myself. But even though I proofread my tweets, I get typos. I proofread my emails, I get something wrong every single time. And like I use the undo send a lot. And I think that's kind of like that would be like that's why people would be resistant to adding that friction, even though it's actually extremely useful. And I guess like another actually example that you can think of that I can think about is, like the most frictionless thing you can do is give everyone admin access to your production environment, right? The developers, they can be trusted, whatever. But actually, no, you want that to be like a multi-step process. I guess this actually connects to what you said earlier about like the security thing. Like if getting access to production systems for like diagnosis, like in Svix, we don't actually have access. The team cannot get access to read customer data, for example. That's completely blocked. But maybe they can elevate their access to run some diagnostic stuff and all of that. And you kind of like want that multi-step process so people understand the gravity of what's going on. Like people understand that, wait, I'm actually now in an environment where I'm allowed to do more things than what I would normally be allowed. And I think that like extra friction is kind of like, which for us it works like you open a ticket, you have to get someone else to approve it, and then you need to reference that, and then you can like elevate to like minimally elevate that access, and like all of that kind of stuff. Like I think really makes you understand the gravity of the responsibility of doing what it is that you're gonna do. And I think that's maybe what you were asking about earlier, which is like friction just for the sake of friction, but it really elevates that experience. Like it really makes people understand that what they're doing. Like they should be careful. And
Yeah.
while removing that just means that like, oh, okay, I guess it's just a UI. I can click buttons. I can do whatever, which is not what
Right.
you want.
So I mean, similarly, like there are still a lot of places I assume where people add friction where they shouldn't,
Yep.
right? There's just classic examples of like too many meetings or too much process. And so like how when you think, oh, I need to add friction here, how can you make sure that it's not like bad friction, I
Yeah.
guess?
I don't think we need to go very far, actually. I mean, we added friction like 2 weeks ago and we dropped it, or 3 weeks ago and we dropped it a week and a half ago. And I think that's kind of like the key. The key is continuously evaluating whether the friction that you're adding is actually useful and actually giving you back more than what you're spending on it, and actually adding value. So the key is really constantly reevaluating and just making sure to remove it if it's not good. And also, I mean, have velocity as like front of mind, so you make sure you don't just like willy nilly add,
Mm.
unnecessary friction. I think those would be the two key things.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just don't be married to the things that you add just because it was you who added them,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. And when
That
you add
happens a
things,
lot,
make
yeah,
sure
for
that
sure.
they're easy to remove, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that was another nice chat. Again, learning things that are a little bit unintuitive for me. Um, so yeah, like if as any of our viewers, if you have any questions, or again, if you all, as always, if you have any topics that you'd like us to discuss, leave them in the comments below. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, Tom.
Perfect. Thank you, Ken.